All right, and welcome back to Calling Out Controversy here on WVCR 8.3 The Saint. Tonight we have a very special guest with us tonight. It's Alberto Gonzales, the former Attorney General of the United States, who is now the Dean at Brendias Law School. So, Dean, thank you for being with us.
Sure, but just a slight correction, I'm the dean at Belmont Law
Oh,
School
sorry,
here in Nashville.
my bad. I mixed you up with another person we had coming on later today. My apologies there.
No problem.
And so, why don't you start us off by talking a little bit about yourself? Just tell us a little about who you are.
I'm a Texan. I grew up in Texas and was in private practice for about 13 years before going into government service when George W. Bush was elected governor of Texas, and I was a general counsel, then became Secretary of State. Then went on the Texas Supreme Court. And then when Bush was elected president of the United States, I became the White House counsel. Did that for 4 years during the President Bush's first term. And then I was nominated and confirmed as Attorney General, and did that for about 3 years during Bush's second term. And presently, I'm the Dean at Belmont Law School in Nashville, Tennessee.
So you're the former Attorney General. You're now a Dean at a law school. So for those who might not know, because everybody kind of sees the Attorney General, like in the past we've had Attorney Generals like Bill Barr or Eric Holder, and people today kind of gotten this convoluted vision of what the Attorney General is. So coming from somebody like yourself who's been in that position, what is the Attorney General really?
Well, the Attorney General, by statute, is charged to provide legal advice for the executive branch and to prosecute, investigate and prosecute violations of federal law. I think that confusion sometimes people have about the position of the Attorney General is that, unlike most cabinet positions, the Attorney General wears two hats. On the one hand, the Attorney General is the person who is primarily responsible for promoting and pushing forth the president's law enforcement policies and priorities. The Attorney General is part of the president's team. The Attorney General goes to the cabinet meetings. The President of the United States campaigned to the American people on a set of law enforcement policies, and it's the job of the Attorney General to make sure that those are carried out. Now, the Attorney General also wears another hat, however, and that is as the chief investigator and prosecutor of the United States with respect to federal offenses. And here is where you want the Attorney General to be totally independent of the White House and totally independent of political considerations. And, that's where criticism that arises oftentimes with respect to the Attorney General is a perception that perhaps someone has put, their thumb on the scale. Someone at the White House or the President has put their thumb on the scales and has affected decisions being made at the Department of Justice. Everyone, I think, would like to think that the Attorney General and the Department of Justice is pursuing justice without regard to any political considerations, personal considerations. It's all about following the evidence and prosecuting wrongdoing. So that's the role of the Attorney General. You have about 110,000 people that work at the Department of Justice. Many major and very important agencies report up to the Attorney General, including the FBI, DEA, Marshal Service. All federal prisons are run by the Attorney General. Every federal prosecutor, when they appear before in federal court on behalf of the United States, all of those people work for the Attorney General.
So another thing that's come up lately over the past few presidencies, and even coming out of the Bush presidency, is that people fear that the Attorney General has become politicized. That's kind of become the president's, besides their chief counsel, the president's top lawyer. And some people have grown majorly concerned about that. Like you had Bill Barr, you had Eric Holder. A lot of people kind of accused them of being either President Trump's or President Obama's top lawyer. Like you had them going after certain cases that the president would have wanted them to, but then kind of ignoring other ones. You have some people saying that Eric Holder, for instance, didn't go after the IRS or the gun running to Mexico, and you have people saying that Bill Barr kind of did a similar thing with Trump. Do you see kind of actions like that, or do you see it kind of from a different way?
Well, there are a number of considerations that go into which cases to investigate and prosecute. The department ultimately does have limited resources, and beginning with the U.S. Attorney's Office here in Nashville, at every U.S. Attorney position, and all these agencies like within the Department of Justice, there always has to be a priority in terms of which cases to investigate. in which case is to prosecute. And the president, for example, if he believes it's important to have civil rights prosecutions, that'll be conveyed to the Attorney General. The Attorney General will convey that to the line people within the Department of Justice. And so there will be a priority there. That doesn't mean that you ignore everything else, but there's a priority there. And the Attorney General himself will have his or her own priorities. And so it may appear that perhaps, there's favoritism, the fact that something is not investigated, but oftentimes it's because there are limitations with respect to resources for the department. But obviously, there is serious concern about the department being politicized, and oftentimes it's because of actions and statements made by the department leadership and not by the career folks. People need to understand that over 99% of the people that work at the Department of Justice are career individuals, Republicans and Democrats. Oftentimes they don't care who the Attorney General is or who is the President. Their job is to simply make sure that justice is achieved, and they go to work every day, day in and day out, on behalf of the American people. It's a less than 1%, the leadership, that oftentimes, they make decisions, they make pronouncements that sometimes people view as controversial, or they question why, the department is heading a particular direction. And I think that's, particularly for the Department of Justice, it's problematic because, again, it's important in the arena of investigations and prosecutions that the department be not viewed as politically motivated or somehow politically affected, but simply doing their job without regard to political repercussions or outcomes. And one of the primary responsibilities of the Attorney General is to protect the reputation of the institution. It's important for the institution. It's also important for the career individuals that work there every day. So, yes, I'm aware of the fact that the department has sort of taken a hit, I think, in recent administrations based upon decisions and pronouncements by the leadership. But I'd like to think that overall the department is doing its job day in and day out.
Now, I kind of have two questions for you. I'm going to kind of try my best to merge into one. Now, in the past, we've also had on another Bush top official during his tenure, which was Christy Whitman, the former EPA administrator. And she kind of had a similar answer to you, where it's kind of like the politicization of the EPA, for instance, because she was the EPA administrator, was similar to the Attorney General's, where it was just coming from the top, where everybody who worked below was not really as politicized as the people at the top. And you kind of also see, as you said, that like the Attorney General's agenda in some ways is conveyed by the president, not fully, but in some regards. Do you also see it as the Attorney General being compromised by Congress and the Senate, or is it just by the viewpoints of the media or the public, or just how it's conveyed by the president and the low staff numbers and funds?
I'm not sure that I understand the question. Are you asking whether or not the agenda, the work of the department, is some way influenced by Congress? Is that your question?
Yeah, part of it. Do you believe that it's been compromised by Congress, or do you think it's just that it's been able to remain as independent as possible from Congress?
Well, of course, we're talking about different branches of government, and there has to be a separation, a divide between the Department of Justice and Congress. Obviously, the Judiciary Committee has oversight responsibility for the Department of Justice, and so at least twice a year I would go up to the Senate Judiciary Committee, and the same with respect to the House Judiciary Committee, and testify about the work of the department. And of course, senators would have their own concerns about what they're reading, what they're hearing in terms of the department being perhaps politicized. Senators will also, and members of Congress will also have their own priorities, hearing from their own constituents back home in terms of why is this happening? Why isn't this being investigated? And they'll ask the Attorney General about that. And oftentimes, particularly in our local matter, the Attorney General there in the hearing won't have an answer unless they've been prepped for the question in advance. And so you tell the member or the senator, I'll have to look at that, and then you go back to the department, and you'll direct, someone on your team to take a look at it, and then we'll file a report back with the member of Congress or with the senator. So, the role of the oversight by the Congress is extremely important. One of the things that I've learned is that that oversight, the ability of both the media and the Congress to check actions of the executive branch is extremely important in our system of government. Otherwise, you have a concentration of power, which I think is unhealthy. I think the framers were very wise in distributing power both horizontally between the three branches of federal government and also vertically between the federal and state governments. And I think that's very, very important. So, yes, of course, the department is influenced by what Congress thinks. And one main reason that I haven't spoken about is because of the appropriations. Congress makes the appropriations. So you want to satisfy Congress that the money that is appropriated is being spent wisely. But there is, of course, that relationship is important. But clearly, there's a divide between the branches of government.
Okay, and then there's another question that I had for you that was given to me by a couple professors here who I told about the interview, and they had one question for you entirely pretty much is, with the increasing power of the presidency, especially over the past few terms, and as we go into the new Biden administration coming out of the Trump administration, are you worried that, especially after the past few presidents, that the executive branch is becoming way too powerful?
Well, what I worry about, yes, I'm surprised about the failure of Congress to exercise authority it has. I mean, I remember when I was White House counsel and going up to the Hill and meeting with members of Congress, with senators, and explaining things that we might want to try to do or were doing, and them responding back, well, you can't do that. We don't want you to do that, or that infringes upon the authority of Congress, the prerogatives of Congress or the Senate. And so they were very, very protective of their power and recognizing that there was three equal branches. So yes, I do worry about that. We have to remember, the President of the United States is the most powerful person in the world. It's incredible. That person has incredible power. And I think most American citizens would sleep better at night knowing that power is constrained by the Constitution, that there are limits to that power, that power won't be abused for personal, political, or financial gain. And I worry sometimes that people have lost confidence in the ability of the other branches to adequately check the President of the United States. Now, one thing that I want to caveat to that is, in times of war, in times of conflict or threats to our country and to our security, we look to the executive branch. The framers intended the executive branch to sort of be the commander-in-chief and to deal with national security threats. And obviously that power is checked to some degree by Congress. But clearly, depending on the circumstances, there is a shifting of balance between security and liberty. And oftentimes, like after we saw in 9/11, you have a very assertive President of the United States taking action consistent with his power under the Constitution. And then, of course, as time and circumstances change, then there's much more desire to see, more protection of liberties. And there is more questioning by Congress as to why the executive needs to take certain actions. So there's always a shift depending on circumstances about the power and the exercise of power by the executive branch, which we've seen from the beginning of this country.
Okay, and then when you look into the future of the Attorney General position with everything you just said, the next Attorney General is going to be Merrick Garland, depending on whether or not he gets confirmed, which most likely he will. How does the nomination of Merrick Garland make you feel more comfortable about that, or do you still kind of feel the same way, that just one nomination won't change anything?
Oh, I have confidence that, I don't know Merrick Garland. I just know him by reputation. I think that his nomination sends the right signal. I think President Biden wanted to reassure everyone that the Department of Justice is going to be making decisions based upon facts and not based upon who's being investigated. And I think for that reason, he wanted someone that was totally independent of the campaign, certainly, of politics, which he has been because of the fact that he's been a federal judge for so many years. And I think he said that, and he found someone who also was not only independent, but someone in a previous life had experience working within the Department of Justice. So he's not going to be coming into this, without any kind of background, without any kind of understanding of how the department works. And of course, he's going to be surrounded by the best and the brightest, and they're there to support him. And I believe that he will be confirmed, and I think he'll do a good job. I really do. I think he will work hard in trying to restore whatever negative things people may feel about the department presently. I think he'll work very, very hard to reassure them that the department is acting the way that our framers intended. That people, when they created the department, I'm not the framers, but when Congress created the Department of Justice, they envisioned, in my judgment, sort of an independent watchdog, independent investigator, independent prosecutor. Again, with respect to specific cases, but also understanding that the President of the United States is entitled to have an Attorney General who is part of his team and will help the President carry out the President's law enforcement policies and priorities.
We're here with Alberto Gonzales on WVCR 88.3 Saint, calling out controversy. And so I want to kind of move on to now a little bit of your tenure in the chair of the Attorney General. You were Attorney General for a few years, as you said, during the Bush administration. One thing that people have kind of gained through, I don't really want to say just pop culture, but kind of also maybe a little bit of news coverage, was that the Bush administration and Bush presidency and the Attorney General were kind of playing second fiddle to Dick Cheney and his lawyers, David Addington in particular. And this may come from stuff like the movie Vice and everything. It's kind of painted Dick Cheney as full control of the White House and everything.
Okay.
Do you,
question?
for people in the audience, is that fully true, or is that just a bunch of baloney?
It's a bunch of baloney. Obviously in the beginning of the administration, I think it's fair to say that Dick Cheney, his opinions were important, and you had someone who had a great deal of experience in Congress, experience as Secretary of Defense, and of course, that first year we were attacked, and the 9/11 attacks happened, and so obviously Dick Cheney had influence on a president who was, had limited experience on the foreign stage. But as time passed, I think it's fair to say that as President Bush acquired more experience, I think that influence waned, quite frankly. And the truth of the matter is, Dick Cheney understood that he was vice president. He's very much institutionalist, and he wasn't elected to make these decisions. He would always be very forceful in expressing his opinions, and was always never shy about telling you that you're wrong. But at the end of the day, he understood who was going to make the decision. And once the president makes the decision, and it wasn't consistent with what Dick Cheney recommended, he would salute and say, yes, sir, let's do it, let's go. The notion that these decisions were made, these major decisions, particularly in the war on terror, were made by Dick Cheney or heavily influenced. He had his say, like we all did. We all had our say, but at the end of the day, the major decisions, as you would want and might expect, they were made by President Bush. And one of the things I always admired about Bush was his ability to make decisions. The presidency is about making decisions one after another after another. And you can't imagine how hard the decisions are. They're incredibly difficult. Oftentimes you have to make them with little time, and you have to make them sometimes with imperfect information. And I always admired the fact that he was willing to make the tough decisions, and then you move on. Why? Because the next big decision is waiting right outside the Oval Office door. You don't have time to hand wring or wonder whether or not you're making a mistake, or being concerned about being criticized for whatever decision you make. I think it's one of the things I really learned about him. To be an effective executive, you've got to be willing to make a decision, and you've got to be willing to make a decision, and you move on.
Yeah, because I'm a family friend of mine was a former lawyer for Bush during the 2000 recount, and he told me that pretty much that whole entire viewpoint that the kind of given in pop culture is kind of incredibly false. In that, I mean, yeah, Dick Cheney was vice president; he'd have a lot of power as vice president, but he wasn't pulling the strings as everybody tends to think he was.
No, and honestly, people who think that or say that, I mean, it's really insulting to George W. Bush. He, believe me, I mean, he was a decision maker. There's no question about it.
Yeah, and also, the same lawyer also told me that pretty much the media portrayal of Bush is also completely off.
Well, yeah, you'd have to be more specific in terms of what he's portrayed. I've got very strong views about George W. Bush as a person, as a chief executive, as a leader, as a husband, even. Obviously, I'm biased, and so people are going to, kind of roll their eyes if I say anything positive about George W. Bush in those roles. But yeah, I have a great deal of regard and affection for him in many areas.
Well, the media portrayals I'd be talking about would be kind of like the ones, for example, on like SNL with Will Ferrell or Frank Caliendo, where he's kind of portrayed as like a toddler almost. And
I never watched all of that. My sons would have finally ended up telling me that I was subject of some ridicule
you
or
were,
comedy
yeah.
on SNL. Listen, that's television. That's comedy. So, and you know what? Bush would laugh at something like that. I'm sure. One of the things that's another thing I always admired about him. He had his mother's personality, and has his mother's personality. And he was always willing to laugh at himself. I think that's very important in a leader because, you know what? You're not perfect. You're going to make mistakes. And I think I'm not suggesting that with respect to a serious mistake you make in the White House that you laugh about it. What I'm saying is, you can't take yourself too seriously all the time. Otherwise, I just think it's not healthy. So and it eases tension during the very difficult times to have someone like that. It's something that I think that made him even more effective, quite frankly, in those tough times.
And I agree with you. So why don't we move on to some of the more foreboding and controversial parts of your tenure as Attorney General? The first of which being Guantanamo Bay, which is closing, or pretty much close to closing. What is your, now looking back to your time as Attorney General and the time that Guantanamo Bay opened during the Bush administration? Do you have a different viewpoint of it now? Because many people today kind of view Guantanamo Bay as kind of something that's avoiding the Constitution, as a stain, as a horrible thing on our reputation abroad. Do you still have a similar viewpoint to when it opened, or has your view kind of evolved on it or changed?
I don't know. Guantanamo Bay was established in terms of as a detention facility, I think sometime in 2002, because we were capturing people in Afghanistan, and we had to do something with them. And there was a great deal of debate within the National Security Council about, well, what should we do? We thought about bringing everyone back into the United States, but we quickly discarded that idea because we had just been attacked, and we felt the American people would not tolerate us bringing terrorists within our borders. So that was gone. We thought about, what about putting them in a facility in Afghanistan as they're being captured? We didn't feel there was a facility there, nor could we build a facility in time that would be secure enough. And there will always be a danger about the security of the guards, but also the security of the health and security of the inmates. So that was gone. We thought about perhaps maybe in an adjoining country. That was quickly discarded as well. We even thought about maybe putting them on a floating battleship. Just have a battleship just floating around, and felt, no, that's not a good idea. And then finally we decided on Guantanamo Bay. The National Security Council decided on that and made the recommendation to President Bush, and he accepted it as the best of a bunch of bad solutions. And the goal there was simply to detain people and to question them. And he made the decision that they would not be entitled to Geneva Convention protections as a prisoner of war because they had not fought consistent with the Geneva Convention. They were enemy combatants is their designation. If they had been designated as prisoners of war, we couldn't question them at all. And besides name, rank, serial number, Social Security. And so obviously in a war on terror, information is very valuable currency, and our ability to question, to ask even the simplest question, to bribe them by giving them a Twinkie, that would be prohibited under the Geneva Conventions. And so we just felt it wasn't appropriate to provide that kind of protection. And so part of the reason for Guantanamo was to detain people we had captured, because we couldn't kill them. Once they surrender or they're captured, it's against the laws of war to kill them. And of course, it's inhumane, and we would never do that. But the other reason for Guantanamo was to have a place where we could gather information that would be helpful in successfully prosecuting the war on terror. And over time, of course, it became controversial. Listen, President Bush wanted to close Guantanamo. He did. Shortly, within a year or two, I think it's fair to say he wanted to close Guantanamo, but we could never give him an adequate alternative that would ensure the security of the United States. You remember that President Obama, his first day in office, I believe, or certainly in the early days, talked about one of my first priorities of closing Guantanamo. It never happened. Why? Because no one could give him a good alternative. Guantanamo existed because it was necessary. It existed because it was also lawful. And so, this notion also that Guantanamo helped recruit more terrorists, than anything else we did, is just false. Listen, people hated the United States. Al-Qaeda hated the United States before Guantanamo. You have to remember that World Trade Center bombings, the bombings in Africa, and of course the attack on 9/11. They hated us, and Guantanamo did not increase that hate. I don't think it contributed at all to any kind of animosity toward the United States. And I regret that people may have a misconception of Guantanamo, but so those are the facts as I remember them.
You also have the attack on the USS Cole, but going into, as you said, that you think or you believe that Guantanamo Bay did not recruit new terrorists, I kind of have two questions going off this, but I'll ask the first one, is that some people refer to institutions that the United States had in other countries like Iraq and Afghanistan, like Abu Ghraib, for instance, which has become notorious or infamous for other reasons, has kind of become, looking back, as they like to refer to as a jihadi university, that the jihadists in there kind of networked with each other, and this is where possibly where al-Baghdadi and al-Zakari came out with the foregoing plans of ISIS, or what would become ISIS. Do you see any issues with those, or is it kind of just like you kind of see those as kind of like it just happened, and even if we didn't have Abu Ghraib or other institutions, it would have happened anyway?
Obviously, this is just pure speculation. I think it would have happened anyway because there were groups and there are individuals that simply hate the United States and hate our values and hate what we stand for. So I think it would have happened. Abu Ghraib is another instance of, I think there's just a huge misconception about what happened there. The treatment by these guards, a particular group of guards on a night shift in a particular cell block that was unique, a very unique circumstance, not for the purpose of gathering intelligence. People think this was about enhanced interrogation techniques on a group of inmates. No, these people were just knuckleheads. These guards were just knuckleheads. This is all for fun, for their own pleasure. It never should have happened. People were held accountable for it. But nonetheless, it stained the Bush administration. I remember the morning that the news was going to break, Jim Haynes, the general counsel at DOD, called me to tell me what was happening. We knew immediately what this would do to the Bush administration, the perception of the Bush administration, what it would do to our efforts to interrogate individuals around the world, the notion that, we mistreat people intentionally, this is part of a plan. But again, this was a group of individuals who were doing what they shouldn't be doing. And, it was very regrettable, and I think it made it more difficult to carry out the war on terror. And, I wish it hadn't happened, but the notion that it was in any way authorized or condoned by the Bush administration is just absolutely false.
We're here with Dean Alberto Gonzales, WBCR 88.3 SAN, calling out controversy. I have one more question on this topic, and then we're going to move on to the next one. And one thing that keeps on coming up when talking about Guantanamo or these sites is the Haynes memo and using the terminology enhanced interrogation versus torture when talking about stuff like waterboarding or other such methods. What was the reasoning behind using wording such as enhanced interrogation versus what many would call torture?
Well, you have to remember that torture is against the law, and we have to be precise in talking about techniques, because certain actions are in fact unlawful. And if you're going to prosecute someone for engaging in unlawful conduct, that conduct has to be clearly defined. And whether we like it or not, the torture statute is pretty vague. And you can have conduct that is inhumane, degrading, and it not be constitute torture. And we get that from memos that the United States submitted in connection with our adoption of the Convention Against Torture. Because for other countries, their definition of torture, the United States, back in the Reagan administration, believed was just too broad. And so we took an understanding and a reservation when the treaty was adopted to make it clear that only conduct that shocks the conscience, depending on the circumstance, would constitute torture. Everything else, we may not like it. If we wanted to outlaw it, we can do that. But everything else, cruel, inhumane, and degrading treatment, would not constitute torture. And, the Department of Justice issued a series of memos trying to define, give guidance to the people, particularly at the CIA, but also at DOD, in terms of the types of actions that they could engage in order to get information. Again, some people describe it as, well, you wanted to give them a roadmap in terms of engaging in torture. No, what we wanted to do is to give them restrictions on what was allowed within the box. That if they perform within the box as outlined in the legal opinion, they would not be prosecuted for torture. People may disagree about where the lawyers drew the box, the lawyers being the lawyers primarily at the Department of Justice. Many of these, this may sound like a self-serving statement, but I'm often tagged with the person responsible for, many of the controversial decisions on the war on terror made during the Bush administration. They were all made during the time I was in the White House. They were made by the Department of Justice under John Ashcroft. Now, I was involved in discussions and decisions, but at the end of the day, the Department of Justice, the Attorney General, has the final word on what is legal and what is not legal. And, and the reason for that is because they're charged by statute to do that, and because when it's challenged in the courts, who's going to have to defend it? The Department of Justice. And so, these are all interrogations, Guantanamo, surveillance, all of these things began when I was in the White House, began with the approval, the support of the Department of Justice saying, yes, if you do these activities a certain way, they would be lawful. If you go outside this box, they're unlawful and you will be prosecuted. It was very important. I can't tell you the number of times when I would have conversations with President Bush, and he would look at me and say, let's just make sure that what we're doing is lawful. When we talked about interrogations, he says, we don't do torture. And so, one of the regrets that I have is this idea that President Bush condoned torture. Far from it. He was very clear with me that the United States does not engage in torture. And the problem we have, of course, is that people have different definitions of torture. And torture is a crime. And there are elements of that crime. And if those elements aren't met, then you haven't engaged in torture and you won't be prosecuted. And that's what all that's about.
Okay, and I want to move on to another topic, which is government surveillance, which is something that came up a lot during the presidency of George W. Bush and also Obama and now Trump. And many people didn't become aware of it until Edward Snowden. And so one question I want to start off with is, do you believe Edward Snowden is a hero or a traitor?
I think, I'm not prepared to call him either one. What I would say is he's a criminal. He violated the law. And so when you violate the law, that's not fair. He has, you're a criminal when you're prosecuted and convicted. And so, but I view him as someone who violated the law.
Okay, because I remember I've heard some people, when the question comes up, it kind of more or less depends on what their political views are. Because I went to a conference when I was in high school, and we had a Homeland Security agent come in, and he called Edward Snowden a giant coward. And so it also kind of goes into, I guess, everything that goes into your worldview and how you view about it. Because, like, right now I have my cell phone right in front of me. Many people believe or have fears that their cell phones are being recorded or listened to, and that every single phone call or text message they make is being recorded by the government.
Well, I think it's certainly true. Your views about what he did, I think that are colored by sort of your worldview or the role of government and your suspicion of government. The truth of the matter is, a couple of points I'd like to make.
Yep.
People are worried about what the government knows about you, but people like Google, Amazon, they know so much more about you. They know, what you like to eat, where you like to shop, things, kind of entertainment you like. I mean, it's all out there. So the notion about privacy, now clearly there's a difference, and the Constitution only applies with respect to what the government does, the protection of privacy. So, I get that. With respect to the surveillance, let me just say that, as I said earlier, knowledge and information is very, very important, currency in fighting the war on terror. And we realized, I remember the meeting in which George Tenet, the CIA director, told the president that, we have these tools, and yet, but it's unclear whether or not we have the authorities to engage in surveillance. And so, again, looking to the Department of Justice, was there a way to do this that would be lawful? And we were given legal opinions by the Department of Justice that it could be done in a way that was lawful, and we began sort of a secret surveillance program. Let me just reassure your listeners that that program was approved by the Attorney General and the Department of Justice. The chief judge of the FISA court was aware of what we were doing because we were presenting information in FISA applications that he had questions about. Well, where are you getting this information? So he knew what we were doing. We briefed the leadership in Congress about what we were doing. They knew about this program. So all three branches of government knew what we were doing. And it was a very important program and was very helpful in terms of gathering information. I think we've had people testify. In fact, I know we've had people testify in Congress under oath that the program and the information gathered from the program was helpful in saving American lives and preventing additional attacks against the United States. So that's sort of my introduction about this topic.
Okay, and when you say that like Google and Amazon know more about us than the government does, many people for some reason treat their phones or Google or something like it's their best friend, that they can trust them with any information, when in reality they send all that information for ads and everything. I mean, everybody has stories about talking about something, and for 3 or 4 days after it, they keep on getting ads. Like I can say like, oh, I need to get new tires for my car, and for the next week or two, I'm getting bombarded with ads about tires. So I mean, everybody has stories about that. I mean, you even chuckled when I said it, and so it's something that it's weird. I mean, I remember watching a documentary, and one of Amazon's executives said that whenever he's having a personal conversation with somebody that's very something personal, he always unplugs his Alexa, or he always talks about how Mark Zuckerberg covers his computer camera with a Band-Aid, and it's kind of weird to think about it that way.
Well, I have something over my computer camera, and I don't have Alexa for that very reason. I'm but it's not so much the government. It's much more, these private companies. There's no question that today the technology that the governments have and private companies have to gather up information, to synthesize this information, collate this information is incredible. And one of the questions, I teach a national security law class, and one of the questions I ask is, do you really think you have privacy today? What does that look like today? What does that mean today? And for most people, the younger generation, we're talking about privacy against the government, but they don't understand or they don't care that you're right. There's so much information out there. The ability to gather up information and develop a footprint, of an individual, is there, and so that's a little bit frightening. I try to be careful about how I communicate. I'm the same way, but I want to reassure your listeners that the government is prohibited from listening in on conversations unless they have a warrant, so, I mean, that's the way it should be, quite frankly. There ought to be limits on the ability of the government to surveil individuals and learn information about individuals. So I'd like to think that is continuing today. I'm sure it is.
And it's interesting to think about, especially because with the current pandemic, I mean, I'm a grad student right now, I'm getting my MBA, and a lot of people who are students right now have to use Zoom or other web services like Skype.
Right.
And for those, you have to have your computer going and you have to have the little camera on. So you can't really cover it up. And
Right.
it's portion because I remember I talked to one student before all this and I asked her, like, oh, you have your camera covered up. And she was like, oh, yeah, because they're always watching you. And I was like, oh, okay. But now you have to have it, if you're a student especially, or even working in an office place, you have to have it uncovered because then you can't get any work done because now they even require you to have your camera on. So, I mean, it's kind of something where is privacy more at stake now due to the pandemic, or is it just the same as it always was?
Well, I mean, I think there are more opportunities, of course, to gather up information today. If you have your camera on or a microphone on somewhere, you're communicating on your cell phone. There's no question about it. But I don't think I'd like to think that's not permanent. And I still today people have choices, and they just have to be smart about how they communicate. Quite frankly, and I just think that I think most people simply forget, don't care, don't view it as a serious issue. I think if you question about the protection of their privacy, they would tell you, yeah, I want my privacy protected, and yet their practice is inconsistent with that statement. And I just think people need to really appreciate how easy it is now to get information about an individual. And if they don't like that, I mean, there are things that can be done, although in an interconnected world that we live in today, it's becoming much more difficult.
Now we're coming close to the end. We got a little bit less than 10 minutes, so I got at most three questions left for you. The first one being, you said that basically in your class that you teach that you asked the question, is privacy possible today, especially with how interconnected the world is? What is your answer to that question? Do you believe privacy is still something that's possible, or you think that now with how interconnected the world is, that it's kind of something that's going to become a historical artifact?
I think it's if not impossible, very very difficult with respect to private actors. Privacy is still possible and necessary until we change the Constitution and our laws vis-a-vis the government. I think we should continue to insist on privacy, and that the reach of the government should be limited by the Constitution and the laws passed by Congress, and it should require a third-party actor like a judge issuing a warrant, except in exigent circumstances or in times of national security. But I do believe it's possible, and I do believe that with respect to the government, it's absolutely necessary that we have checks on the government.
All right. And then the final two questions that I have for you are one being, what was your favorite thing about being a public servant or being attorney general? And the second one being, is there anything that you want to get off your chest or say before we end this interview?
Well, I miss the action. When I left government service, I had dinner, I think one or two nights afterwards, and with Hank Paulson, at the time Treasury Secretary, and we were chatting, and he said, Al, he says, you'll never have a job as rewarding, as challenging as the job he just had. And it's true. I mean, to be the Attorney General of the United States, a cabinet secretary, I mean, it just doesn't get any better than that. Although I must say that I'm often asked, of everything you've ever done, which did you enjoy the most? Probably being White House counsel, because it wasn't as stressful. And also, if you're an American citizen and being able to go to work every day at the White House, it just doesn't get any better than that. So, I really enjoyed both positions very, very much. But it's the ability to make a difference, and I think we're all given God-given talents to make a positive difference in the lives of others. And I'd like to think that I did that. Was my service perfect? No one's service is ever perfect. But I know that I did the very best I could, and I'm grateful, and I'm most proud of the role that I played, however small, in making sure our country was protected, working with President Bush and trying to keep our country and our fellow citizens protected. That's what I'm most proud of. And your last question was what again?
If there's anything that you want to say during this interview that you haven't gotten a chance to say, like you want to say but you haven't gotten a chance to say because either I haven't asked a question about
Oh
it
yeah,
or
I would say is It's easy to be critical of our public officials, to second guess our public officials, and just remember that oftentimes they make decisions based on information that we don't have. I'm asked all the time about decisions by Bill Barr and my successors, and sometimes I have questions about decisions or pronouncements, but then I always remind my audience and myself, I don't know what they don't know. They have information I may never know. And so if I had the same information, perhaps I would make the same statement or make the same decision. So just be mindful, be respectful. The other thing is, you go into public service. I say go in with your eyes open and your armor on. It's hard. It shouldn't be this hard, but it is. You get criticized for what you do, even if it's right. But I would do it again in a second. Now, my wife probably wouldn't let me do it, but I would, because it's so rewarding. It's so much fun. It's why I became a lawyer, is to make a difference. And so you have a lifetime to make money, and if you have the opportunity to serve others, find a way to do that, because I guarantee you it'll make you better in your profession, but it also will make you a better person.
All right, so Dean Alberto Gonzales, thank you for being with us. This has been WVCR 88.3 The Say and calling out controversy. So thank you, and we very appreciate you coming on.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.